How are you? Okay, so am I on? Am I good? Okay, perfect. Good morning. No. Good morning, everybody. Wednesday, are we going to get Pinkster? Good morning, everybody. Okay, in psychology, I did study psychology. I know that you have a concentration span of 45 minutes as an adult. Truth. So please, can we all stand up? You've been studying for much longer than that. And just give yourself a good stretch, please. I saw a lot of people leaving. Please, this is not going to be boring. I promise. Good yawn there, sister. I like it. Okay, you can take your seats. I do have a very big watch on because I'm a timekeeper. So don't worry. You'll get your lunch. Today I'm going to be actually not having a PowerPoint. I did that for a purpose. In the introduction, the wonderful gentleman said that I'm a theologian. We have way too many in the room today, I think. But I am an Old Testament theologian, which means that Hebrew thought is important to me. The thought of our ancestors are important. In Hebrew thought, it's not about notes. It's not about information. It's about what someone says and how it makes you feel. Because if you can connect emotionally to something, you will remember it. That's why we remember movies and scenes. Like if I talk about The Notebook, you will legit remember that movie because of how it made you feel. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you about what I believe the call of the Christian journalist is. And I'm glad my brother was fired up before and being very upfront, because I'm going to be very upfront today as well. Very upfront about how I believe we need to be and the revolution we need to begin as Christian media. And I hope this is working. If it is not, give us a bit of a shout. It is. You can hear me. I just can't hear myself. I'm going to be sharing a lot about story and about the things that I've experienced, not so that it's my focus or my story, but because I genuinely want to tell you what I've seen. I was driving in a blue and beige van. And we were driving along in a very, very poor area. And as I looked out of the window, there was a young girl sitting on the side of the road with her mouth open. She was wearing a pink shirt. Her cheeks were filthy, and all her tears did was wipe at the dust and the dirt that was on her face. She had very fine hair and a very small body. I don't know what was around her feet. I was too afraid to ask. She was Asian. She was not South African. Neither was she African. There was a woman in an orange and a gold dress that walked past her that was carrying some vegetables. While the young girl sat on the side of the pavement and started crying, no one stopped. She wasn't homeless. But no one, not a single soul, stopped. She was about 5 or 6 years old, maybe younger or older, I don't know. She could have been malnutritioned, and that's why she looked so young. Her hair was fine. She had on, I would say, probably a pair of trousers, but I could not make them out. There was so much filth on her and around her. Again, I say it again. It bothered me because nobody stopped. There were so many scooters and so many people, but not a single soul stopped. And her mouth was red, she was dehydrated, and all she did was cry and wrap her small arms around her very, very small body. I said to the guide who was in the van with me, he was also a Christian in an Asian country, why is no one stopping? But why? He said, and I've written it down, he said, this is the way it is here. I don't know why. I said, whose child is this? And the van kept on going. And I kept on looking through the window, even though I was asking him questions. And I could not help but see this red mouth and this dirty pink shirt and her cries, and that's all I could see. It was all I could see. And I asked, why? Why? And he said to me, because she is a girl. That was the answer. Because she is a daughter. That is why she's sitting on the corner. And I said, but why? And it was all I could keep on saying, but why? And he said 100 million little girls have been aborted in China in 30 years. And if they make it that far, that is what happens. That was not my first time I encountered gendercide in China. Not the first time. The first time I saw it, but not the first time I ever heard about it. The first time I heard about gendercide, not genocide, gendercide, the routine killing of a person or a child based on the fact that they are born a specific gender. The first time I heard about gendercide was God. One day, just looking at my computer and doing some research for my master's degree, which I was doing at the time, I read about this basin that is placed on the table when women give birth. Now, there's a lot of mothers, I'm sure, in this room today. And you know what it's like to give birth to a baby. It should be a beautiful experience. But in China, when a daughter is born, if she's not aborted through mass sterilization or through gender selective scans that happen while the mother is pregnant, often a baby girl will be born, and instead of going into that basin and being washed clean with that water, which is how we should clean our children when they're born, instead of going into that water to be clean, she will go into that water and be drowned. It is the reality. And it is the reality because of the culture that is persistent in many Asian countries. That men matter more than women do. And there's many reasons for that. To go back to that van experience of actually physically seeing a small little girl abandoned on the side of the road. That guide, when he said to me, it is this way because she is a daughter, he also looked down and had tears, unfallen tears in his eyes because of his own conflict. And he said to me, I hope we can change it. And I laid my hand on his shoulder and I said, we will. I don't know how, but we will. And the point of the matter was that so many years before, I had read about gendercide on the computer and had a panic attack. For real, had a real panic attack, and I didn't sleep very well that night. And sometimes, I want to tell you something, sometimes your call and your destiny begins with a panic attack. Because God is not looking to comfort us. We are not fragile. We are anti-fragile. Do you know that? It's actually a system they use in economics, fragile or anti-fragile. We treat one another as though we are fragile, but we are not. We are resistant. And so God shocked me by telling me there were all these baby girls dying in China. And I really had a panic attack and could not sleep. And a couple of days later, I was at a prayer and worship ceremony, and the praise was on, Pinkster praise, and we were praising. And suddenly, the worship started, which was nice because we were kind of mellowing down into this worship. And I heard God suddenly say to me, how many Esthers, Ruths, Deborahs, and Marys have been killed in China since the 1980s? God, why are you asking me this question? He's like, I want you to tell me how many have been killed in China since 1980. And that's how loud his voice became in my ears. And I said 100 million, because I'd read the stat. And in that moment, my heart broke, and all of God's Spirit poured out upon me, and he said, what are you going to do about it? And I said, there's nothing I can do on my own. So he said, no, you're not on your own. There's many people who are doing this. And this started years of a journey of understanding gendercide in China and working with gendercide in China. I met a wonderful woman named Abigail, and I really do want to share her story with you today. Because let's face it, as Christian media, a huge part of what we do is story. Whether you're on the radio, whether you're listening to people's story, whether you're writing someone's story, a huge part of what we do is story orientated. I don't know if we realize we have this massive privilege when we sit in a studio and have a guest come in and share their testimony. It's a privilege, which I'm going to touch on, why we need to start taking this more seriously. I want to tell you a little bit about Abigail's story, and I have her permission to share her story with you today. And this is what she says. She says, growing up in a village in northeast China, I was never celebrated and I was never welcomed as a girl. The traditional thought that sons are more valuable than daughters have been so deeply ingrained in the fabric of Chinese society and in rural areas that this gender preference is so painfully strong. My grandmother used to scold me so furiously for the smallest mistakes, but to my older brother, she was always kind, tolerant, patient. They invested in his education, but not in mine, as they said it was a waste of time. In China, girls are expected to tie the knot as soon as possible so that they won't turn into what is known as a leftover woman, a derogatory term that Chinese people use to refer to single ladies. So if you're single, you're a leftover woman. Leftover women are a disgrace to their family, bringing on them shame and anxiety. And so, practices such as arranged marriages are very prevalent during the Chinese New Year. That was something I didn't know. During the Chinese New Year, many young people get married, are forced to get married. So women fear this joyful celebration. When I was 23, my family found me a man who was much older. I married him, and the marriage failed. I met another man, dated him for 2 months. He was binge drinking, doing bad things, and so I left him. I eventually became a migrant worker such as 230 million other Chinese people are. One day I attended a church, and I heard the pastor preaching on the sin of abortion because of what happens in China. 2 days later, I found myself pregnant. Although I really wanted to give birth to the child that I'd had with the man that I had left, I knew that most people in my family would pressurize me to abort my child. The fact of the matter is, 13 million abortions are performed every year in China. Most of them are forced, most of them are coerced by family members, spouses, partners, husbands, as well as the government. China has a stringent family planning regulation that states any children born out of wedlock are not qualified for an identification document. If you are not married, your child will not have access to school, any travel on public transport, medical care, medical facilities, and they definitely cannot receive any kind of grant because you are not married. This is a system that is known as a hukou. It's still enforced today. After much deliberation and prayer, I sensed the best thing for me to do was to find someone who could adopt my baby. And so I set about going back to the pastor to discuss the options with him of what it would mean when I found out I was also bringing a girl into the world. I'm going to leave you hanging with that story. I'm not even going to tell you what happened. But I want to ask you a question. How do you feel when I share these stories with you? What's the emotion that you feel or experience when you hear that this is what's really happening? I hope you don't, I'm sure you feel a little bit sad, but don't feel too like, This is the power that we hold in our hands, that I have witnessed over the last 12 years. I haven't tied this story up with a neat bow, and I haven't even given you hope. But in a way I have. Because I'm creating an awareness on something that maybe you knew a little bit about but didn't know fully about before you walked into this room this morning. And you can go away and you can tell your family members, this is what I heard. Or you can go and research on the internet and find out there's wonderful documentaries made about gendercide in China. And by the way, it happens in India too, where women actually do crazy things, bury their children alive because they are girls. One lady whose story I heard buried 7 daughters, one after the other, until she had a son. And while she was burying them, she was smiling because she doesn't understand anything else. It's so culturally ingrained that it becomes how you see life. Why am I sharing this with you today? We cannot shy away as Christian media from telling the truth. I have felt as a journalist and a Christian journalist, and I don't characterize myself as a Christian journalist, simply a journalist, that we sometimes shy away from that which is uncomfortable. We tell the end of the story instead of the beginning of the story. If I tell you about Ruth, who went into a Sudanese refugee camp 4 years ago, I can stand here and I can tell you that she was very scared. When Ruth went into that Sudanese refugee camp, she was incredibly afraid. But in that camp, guess what? She met Jesus. She's a Muslim, right? She met Jesus and has Bible study in a small little tent, and a few women get together and they speak the gospel and they preach and they uplift one another. And as a Christian journalist, I should end there, but I'm not going to. Because as a Christian journalist, I do Ruth a disfavor if I don't tell you today that she still struggles with depression and that she still is living in filth and that she still doesn't have ID documents and can't find work because she isn't properly registered. And when she says to me, sometimes it's really hard to be alive, I'm not going to turn around and say, she met Jesus, everything is okay. I cannot do that, and we cannot do that anymore. We have to say she met Jesus, but yet it is hard. Because I don't know about any of you sitting here, but I know Jesus, and I can tell you, life sometimes is very hard. It is very hard. And as Christian journalists, we've told the end of the story from the beginning, which is what I mean by going, hey, she met Jesus and everything is okay, but it's not. I want to tell Ruth that you are seen. I see you. Isn't that the essence of Sawubona? Sawubona is not just what we hear when we fly SAA, Hi guys, Sawubona, Anyone that speaks Zulu and that's a native Zulu speaker will know that Sawubona means so much more than just hello, what we've made it to mean. The very first ancestors of Sawubona knew that it means we see you. So when you say to someone Sawubona, it means I see you. And right now I'm seeing you, but I'm not really seeing you. I'm not seeing into you. And the response to Sawubona, if you're a Zulu, is, and my pronunciation won't be so great, but it's Ingikona, which means I have been seen. I am here. I have been seen. When the angel of God met Hagar at the well, it was that experience where Hagar, we know, was that slave and had run away. She's sitting by this well. The angel of God appears to her, which we believe is Jesus Christ pre-incarnate, and says to her this wonderful conversation, asks her all these questions about herself. Therein lies the key. And listens to what she says and then gives her a directive. But Hagar doesn't just go, oh, thanks, I'm going to do what you're telling me to do. Hagar turns around and says, you are El-Roi. Anyone that knows Hebrew a little bit or knows it a lot will know that that doesn't just mean you are the God who sees, as we read in our English translations. It means you are the God who sees into me. If you're a slave your whole life, the biggest blessing that you could ever receive was someone that sees you for who you actually really are, within. Not on the outside, not as a slave, not as the title of refugee or daughter in China, but for who you truly, really are. It's the gift. And that place where she's sitting becomes known as Be'er Lahai Roi, the well, the living well of the one who sees. And I think that is the calling of Christian media. We need to be a living well of people who truly see the people we serve, who truly see the people we write about, that we invite into our studio, whose stories we bear, whose stories we are blessed to be able to tell. I once was listening to radio a very long time ago, and I was driving in the car, and this was probably like 12 years ago. And I wasn't going to say this, but maybe God wants me to say this. There was a Christian program on, and a lady was interviewing another lady. And the lady that was being interviewed was talking about how her husband had had a dreadful affair, like over many years, and had messed up their marriage. And she was telling this very, very deep story. And the person that was interviewing her could only say, "You're such a beautiful woman. I can't believe your husband did this to you." Don't know if I should just stop right there. Not really sure. I was not into radio journalism at that time, okay? I just sat there and said to my husband, like, what the hell? And there was an awkward silence on the radio. So obviously, the guest was like, well, that's not what I was looking for, you know. I could have gone to Crystal Towers for a drink and someone would have told me the same thing, you know. I need someone to see me. I'm still in the waiting room of the mourning and the grief and the pain of the fact that someone's rejected me, pained me, hurt me, broken up my life. I don't need you to tell me I'm beautiful. I need you to hold space for my story. If we start to see ourselves as merely vessels and conduits of other people's stories, we will begin to see that their stories are sacred. How do we love someone else? By allowing them to be seen. And I believe that that one single moment should be a teachable moment, even for me. I'm definitely not perfect. Okay? Seriously. When I hear people's stories, sometimes I'm trying to figure out how do I respond because these stories are intense. But sometimes you just have to hold space for that story, and even if it's on the radio. Because we're always scared of that radio silence, you know, where it gets a bit crazy. But it's the greatest gift when once you go to a song break and you and your guests have time to just take a moment together where they say to you, "Thank you so much. I feel seen. It was so easy to talk to you. Thank you." That is the greatest gift. Because you're allowing your guests to be seen, but I want to tell you something else. You're allowing your invisible audience to be seen too. When they are listening on the radio or they're reading in your magazine that you've written for, they feel seen when someone else shares that actually my life isn't okay. My life is not okay right now, and it sucks, but someone else has just told me their life isn't okay, and it sucks as well, so we're in this together. So it's great. Life is going to get tough sometimes. I truly believe that when we tell the truth, and that's the messy truth of what we see, the stories we hear, the moments that we encounter, we can do so in a way that honors the gospel. Because we need to be a people of light and a people of the gospel. When we get uncomfortable with the conflict of life, we actually honor the gospel. Because the people that heard Jesus and asked him questions, sometimes he didn't give them immediate answers. He let them sit in the conflict of life and that which was uncomfortable. Because sometimes we've got to discover the answers for ourselves, and sometimes we won't have those answers this side of eternity. But when we tell truths and we tell stories, and when I tell you about this young little girl who I can't get out of my mind, 10 years later, I'm telling you that this is part of us seeing her. And by speaking about her story today, we say that she is not alone. Even though she may not be able to hear our voice, it resonates and echoes out. I also want to say that I connected with a random stranger on social media, and I had the privilege of interviewing her on my show, and she was someone from Iran. Now we should know what is happening in Iran, okay? We know that Mahsa Amini was killed in September last year in police custody, and it sparked protests in that country that's still ongoing now. I connected with a random Iranian woman online, and I invited her onto my show, and we spoke about her homeland, her people, her story. We didn't tie it up with a neat bow, and she's a Muslim woman. But at the end of that show, she said something that was like crazy. And she said, "You're a Christian woman interviewing me on a Christian radio station on the tip of Africa. I'm a Muslim woman who has just fleeing Iran, living as a refugee in Germany, but I'm speaking on your radio. Thank you. Because now I feel like we are in this together." And can't I say, I just put this thing away now and go and sit down, because I feel like I've just lived a million lives when someone says that. And it wasn't about me. It was about the fact that we showed up for someone else. And we did that together, because that's the power of what we can do. It's not about tying it up with a neat bow and going, everything's going to be okay. There's still protests today. Women are still being killed for not wearing a hijab. But when we tell those stories and we allow ourselves to be vessels and conduits for the messy truth, we begin to educate people. And we as a Christian media need to be a voice of education as well. When I want to find out what's happening in Iran, I don't go to Christian media. I go to other media. I'm not going to tell you where. I'm not allowed to name it. I'm being filmed. You go to secular media. Why have they become the voice that we turn to when we need to hear something? We need to be the voice of the people of Iran. We need to be the voice in the people of Ukraine. Don't forget that there's a war. I connected with another random stranger on the internet, which seems to be something I do a lot of. But this beautiful woman who's in Odessa, that lives in Odessa, that's been bombed all the time, and what I randomly do with her, I'll never meet her in real life. Of that I'm convinced. But I just send her messages every now and then and say, "How are you?" She's not a Christian, and she says, "Thank you for caring. You make me feel like I'm not alone." Brene Brown, that I love so much, and probably many of you love, she says that courage starts with showing up and letting ourselves be seen. When you meet someone, and we as Christian media, journalists, whatever we want to call ourselves, radio presenters, writers, editors, when we share the stories of the people that we meet, that we know, that we interview, that we hear, realize that it takes a lot of courage for them to show up and be seen. So let's honor them and be dignified. So as an Old Testament theologian, I love, obviously, the Old Testament, and particularly the guidelines God gave for holy living, found in the first 5 books. And Deuteronomy 22 verse 4 says the following: "If you see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen on the road, you must not look away, but you must help lift it up." It's like, what's a donkey or like an ox got to do with Christian journalism? God gave guidelines for holy living in order to teach us incredible lessons. I've actually experienced this. I've actually experienced this. I've waited with an animal for a couple of hours before its owner came. I've done this 3 times. The point of the matter is, don't turn a blind eye to the suffering of others. If you can help them, the word in the original says, lift it up. What does that mean? We help others by lifting them up, by being with them in their suffering, by being with them in their journey. If you travel to a refugee camp, it's not nice. But you can be there in the people suffering and tell their stories when you leave, with their permission, of course, and in a dignified way. And that's something that I do want to say today as Christian media. And I gave that example of a woman that's husband's having an affair and us just saying, "You're very beautiful. Why did that happen?" That's not dignified. Remember that even if you tell the story of someone who is suffering and who is sitting in filth and in their own filth, you can tell it in a way that's dignified. Protect their dignity because they're still a human being. I'm going to do this in 10 minutes. I'm going to wrap up in 10 minutes. I genuinely am. Proverbs 31 verse 8-9 says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak up for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Open your mouth and judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Who's supposed to do that? Is that our brother sitting here that works with homeless people? Yes, of course. But all of us. The greatest challenge, and I want to say this from my heart today, from the heart of God that was just really impressing this upon me as I was preparing. The greatest challenge that we face as Christian media is the habit of disengaging, ignoring, and running away from that which is considered controversial. The reason for this, why do we disengage, ignore, and run away from that which is considered controversial? The reason for this is because anything considered controversial means that you have to take a stand based on what you believe to be true, correct, and right. And there's a lot of people looking down now when I say this. This means you have to place yourself in harm's way in order to take a stand. We resist this because it's in direct opposition to the way that we want to live, but it's also in direct opposition to the way that the Acts of the Apostles, written about in the book of Acts, actually plays out. They did not run away from that which was considered controversial. You know, in the first century, the gospel was considered exceptionally controversial, for which people died. Our ancestors died. Our fathers and mothers of the faith died for that which was considered controversial. But never once did they say, well, I'm not going to talk about that because it might upset somebody. I cannot shy away from talking about female genital mutilation, for example, or the role of the church in child brides in Africa. We talk a lot about the continent of Africa and the hope. Well, let's face together the fact that the church is playing a huge role in marrying off young girls in Africa. I cannot shy away from that truth. It's controversial, yes, but it's truth. As Christian media and as journalists, my role is, and it's your role, it's not just mine, to say that which is controversial. When Jesus said, eat my body and drink my blood, it was one of the most controversial statements you could ever make, right? It said that so many of his followers actually just turned away from following him. When he turned to his closest disciples and said, well, you too leave. And Peter says, where would we go? You're the only one that has the words of life. To whom would we go? The things that Jesus said and the things that he faced were so controversial that many people turned away. But if we're worried about the people that turn away, we don't care about the people that we're called to serve. God's way of working in this world is through you and me. And we can't deny that. It's not just me. And the truth of the matter is that China had a one-child policy in place since the 80s, since the communism came in. And the one-child policy was ultimately big time involved with why daughters were getting systematically aborted and killed. Through the work of millions of activists around the world, the one-child policy was abolished in 2014. Single biggest victory that was ever had by millions of activists around the world. It wasn't just me that needed to tell somebody. It was millions of us together. And can I tell you something? 90% of those people were Christians that had worked tirelessly to end the one-child policy in China. When we together do something and create the awareness, speak to the controversial, we ourselves will be astounded at what we see. And I want to say that in 2019, there was a huge, I'm not even going to expound on this too much, but there was a hugely controversial thing that actually broke out in South Africa at the time among Christian community. And I was super blessed, and I can see wonderful Vanna Bum there smiling at the back. And I'm not going to even tell the story too much. But you know what? It was something that was very controversial in the Christian and in the natural world, right? And secular media jumped on board because it was a Christian video and it was shared far and wide. I don't want to go into it too much. Secular media jumped on board us. And they said that we are a cult, that we are wrong, and we are this and this. Christian media was silent. No one dared to speak up for that which we felt was true. And I was sitting there listening to the secular media, radio shows were being held about you and me. And yet none of us wanted to raise our voice on that which was considered controversial. And the reason I'm singling Vanda out was because Vanda, in a huge step of faith and with so much faith and trust, came to me and said, I'm entrusting you to actually speak about this on radio. I was very nervous because I was like, everyone's going to be listening, I can't mess this up. And you know what was amazing to me was in the space of 1 hour, I was able to get every single person that was involved with that situation onto the radio. It was a huge miracle. But what was even more amazing to me was when I could finally engage with the person that made the video that suddenly everyone was against, I actually heard something that was completely different from what we experienced. Because the secular media were telling us the story. We weren't telling the story. And when that man that made that video spoke to me, he told me about miracles that were happening because of that video. When the secular media were telling us that we are a cult, and that we are wrong, and that we are judging, and that we are to blame. But when I went to the heart of the matter, I found that it was a completely different story. I sat at the end of that show, and I just sat stunned in my chair. And I just said to myself, this is not what I heard. This is not what Facebook has told us or the secular media. That is what we also need to do. We cannot shy away from that which is controversial because what is controversial holds a truth that we might never discover if we don't go further. We can't allow thoughts to be informed by the secular media. We always talk about let's change the world. Well, let's change it by telling the truth. I'm going to end off with saying that some of you might be going, yes, amen, because that's you. And so I commend you for that. If you're part of that activism, go and do it. People that are telling the truth with dignity and honoring the people you serve. Some of you might be feeling convicted, and that's good too. Some of you might not like what I'm saying, or you feel angry, or you feel bored. That's fine. There's a reason why you feel an emotional reaction towards anything that anybody says. And it's up to you to examine why it feels that way. Oftentimes we build up something, and we're so used to it being that way that when it is challenged, it's very difficult to be challenged. I pray that we will have a revolution in how we do Christian media. If I'm in a blessed position to be an ordained minister that travels a lot with my husband, who's also an ordained minister, and be a journalist. And you know what? One of the things that I see whenever we go, especially into Africa or into Asia, is that people want to tell me their stories really quickly. And they want to tell you their story really quickly because you're a faith leader. So I've realized that being a faith leader is a blessing. And then also I tell them I'm a journalist. Is it okay to share the story? They say yes. People want to open up to you because you are a person of faith. And that comes with a huge responsibility. People want to open to you because God is within you. And they want someone to bring them hope, but they also want to be seen. We carry that within us. Regardless of how broken or imperfect we are, we carry that within us. So people want to open up to us and share their stories. So why don't we take what they share, see them as beautiful and sacred and their stories as worthwhile, and decant it in a way that creates awareness to change the world. We will change the world when we start creating awareness. Don't rely on secular media to do it. We need to be that voice that changes things. And it's not just for young people or for activists or for the millennials in the house. Sure, there's quite a few. There's some millennials here. Yoo-hoo, there's 1, 2, 3. See you when you start putting up your hand. It is really the millennials that want to be activists and try and change the world. But maybe that's our spiritual DNA. And there needs to be a space created for us to fully embody our spiritual DNA as people who change the world, idealistic as it may be. So let us be people that don't shy away from controversy. The next time something controversial lands on your desk and at your radio station, maybe you should give it some thought. How can we speak about this in a way that is going to be good for for our Christian audience, but that we can also start changing things. And when you encounter someone that shares a story, how can you do it in a way that is dignified? And we usually have questions and answers. Yes, it's 20 past 12. See, I did it. I will take questions for 5 minutes. And because I know that you're probably hungry or thirsty. So if there's any questions, please don't make them too hard. I might not know the answer. I'll find someone who does. Any questions, comments?